Hi, Terry Mathis with ClearOne, and guess what I got last week? Our new Converge Huddle from ClearOne. It's a great little piece that will help you with a lot of different scenarios, but you may need a little walkthrough on how to put it all together, how to make your connections and your configuration. So if you want to learn how to put that together, watch this next ClearOne University video. This Converge Huddle is a perfect device to give your clients not only professional audio and video in huddle rooms, but also to make it easy for the end user to connect to. This video is going to help you with some of the configurations and some of the connections on how to make those, and also go over some new enhancements within the new software to make your jobs easier. So let's take a look at the front and the back of the actual Converge Huddle. The front is really more for the end user to use. What you'll find on the front is an HDMI output for the display in the huddle room, a network pass-through that can be connected to the network for internet access through the next port, which is the USB 3.0. By using the USB 3.0, the end user will be able to connect one USB cable to utilize DisplayLink to get professional audio, video, and a display for presentations. There are two other USB connections for peripherals like cameras or USB microphones. There is a locate button to identify the device in the software, as well as power and status LEDs. I will talk more about these connections in another video for the end user. To configure the Converge Huddle, we have to make connections to the back of the unit. On the back, you will find a PoE connection to connect to a PoE injector or PoE switch. So no power supply is needed. Just connect the unit to PoE and you will get power. There are two connections for two speakers. The Converge Huddle has about 10 watts per channel, so you can connect a set of ceiling speakers or bookshelf speakers. So setup is very easy. There are two line-out connections in case you wanted to send the audio to a dedicated amp to power speakers either in the room or somewhere else. There are 3 mic inputs and 1 line input, so you could have 3 individual mics, or in my case, that what I'll be hooking up is I'll just connect a single ceiling microarray microphone that has 3 elements, so all 3 inputs would be used. The last connection is for a 3.5 millimeter cable to connect to a phone so it could be used for audio calls in the conference. There is another Ethernet connection next to the PoE that is used for a future connection for a Bluetooth expander, so a phone could be paired instead of using the 3.5 millimeter cable. So to get started, before you connect to power, let's make all the appropriate connections. First, connect either 1 or 2 speakers to speaker 1 and or 2. If you do use one speaker, just connect to speaker 1 to make configuration easy. If using a ceiling mic array like I'm using, just make the connections to mics 1 through 3. Now that you have these connections made, you should now connect the data connection from the PoE injector to the network you're going to use. This typically could be a switch that is connected to a router, but you could connect directly to a router if you have enough ports to connect to. You just want to be able to get a DHCP IP address for the Converge Huddle so you can connect to it. You can now connect either wired or wirelessly to the network so you can connect to the Converge Huddle. Now you can connect the data power connection to the Converge Huddle to get power to it and get it on your network. Next, you'll want to make sure to get the latest software loaded on your computer. As of the date of this recording, you need to install at least ProConsole 6.0.21.0. When installed, you will notice at the top you have a choice of Converge Huddle or Converge Pro 2. So the nice thing about this software is that you could configure huddle rooms as well as larger rooms with CP2 products all in one software. When you connect to the Huddle, the login is the same as before using ClearOne and Converge. Or you can use Alt and Control and connect, and you don't have to type the login information. When you're connected, you will see information about the device, the Huddle, the firmware it's on, the serial number, IP address, MAC address, subnet and gateway, things like that information. But you also will notice that I'm actually on a 1.0.18.0. You will probably at the very beginning maybe have a .17. The way to find out if you have a new firmware, we'd always download that most recent that would come out. And when new firmwares are available, you would download that, and then you would just send that information to the Huddle itself. But just be aware, make sure you're on the latest firmware. There is a time section. You can edit your time settings, so if you want to change it to whatever time zone you're in. I happen to be in the Eastern time zone in the US. I am actually using daylight savings here in the US. You can use network time. And you could also just put in the current time, whatever you want as well. There is also a section to send a project to the file, to the actual unit. And you can also save the project to your PC. So I will show you some of those here in a few minutes. You can also restart the unit and also factory restore the default. There is also a log files section at the bottom that you would use maybe with tech support who may actually have you do that. Now I'm going to skip real quickly to matrix view, and if you'll notice, just right out of the box you already have your cross points ready to go. So there's not a lot you have to work with, and we'll come back to matrix view in a few minutes. But what if you wanted to rename the microphones, like I'm using the ceiling mic array microphones? You don't have a naming section when you're live with a unit. So if you go back to admin, you could just save this project to your PC. There is a Huddle default, and that's the one it comes with. But I actually called mine Huddle default Terry demo. And as I saved that to my laptop, I would then have that on my laptop. And then I could send the project file when I make those changes over to the unit so it has the most recent changes that I wanted to make. So we'll talk about some of those things in a few minutes. But just to kind of give you an example of that, if I close this, I'm actually connected directly to that. But if I open up another instance of Pro Console, I could actually just open up my little demo here that you see, and this is offline where I'm not connected directly to it. Then if I go to here, this is where you would see the naming section. So I could rename the mics 1, 2, and 3 CMA mic 1, 2, and 3. If I wanted to name my speakers something different, or if I had outputs going to an amplifier, ceiling speakers, if you wanted to do that, you can rename all these things, and then you would just save that or save it as whatever you want it to be. So now that you've made those changes, all you have to do is get live with your Huddle again and go back to the bottom and see send project to file. And then all you would do is just go grab the project that you just made those changes and saved it when you were offline, and then open that, and now it will send that project to the Huddle itself. It will load the project, and then it would eventually get your live properties, and then you're up and running. Under settings, you will now see that this is where you could change the username and password. You have SMTP and SNMP settings where you could set up an email for errors and things like that. And then if we go to matrix view, as I showed you earlier, it's already predefined, already has everything that you need within there to get it started right out of the box. But sometimes maybe the mics where they are located are not really loud enough, or maybe you need a little more signal coming through there. So what you could do is go to channel properties, and then you could collect the first one and maybe hit shift and highlight all of them, And now they're on top of each other. Notice if I expand them, they'll be all expanded out. But if I collapse them, I can say, well, I want them all to sync together, auto sync. So if you now are within your settings with your particular mic and you're trying to optimize your gain structure, again, I'm trying to get 0, +3, +6 areas, what I'm looking for. And on the post-gate section, that's what I'm trying to look for as well. So make sure you have a good optimized gain structure. So to optimize gain structure, you want to make sure, because the default, when you first get the system, it will maybe be at 41 coarse gain. And that's meant to be maybe a ceiling mic array that's up on a ceiling at a regular height down from the ceiling. But if you're doing it for a demo purposes, or the mic is only a few feet away from you, you may have to adjust your coarse gain down just so you're not getting too hot of a signal that could be distorted to the far end. So in my particular case, my microphone is about 2 to 3 feet away from where I'm speaking. So I brought mine down to around 21 or 14 or so to get a much better signal coming through the actual system. Just be aware, if you do this, it's probably a good practice to go back to admin after you've made these changes and then save this project to your PC. As I mentioned earlier, save it to over the project you want it to be called. And after you save it, it would be a good practice to go ahead and send that actual project right back to your Huddle. So just keep that in mind, that after you make these changes that I just showed you, is to save it to your particular project. Also notice that by default, the phantom power, that's this little button here, will be on by default. It's sometimes thinking that you may have a ceiling mic array that does need phantom power to power that particular mic. Notice that mine, I actually turned my phantom power off because I'm using the new ceiling mic array Analog X that has its own interface, that has its own power. So that's one reason, keep that in mind, that you see the phantom power button may be on, but if you have a mic that does not need phantom power, you can just turn that off. You do have noise canceling, and you also have filters, and AGC and ALC. So maybe in some cases a ceiling mic, I would maybe use ALC, and in some cases if I'm moving around quite a bit. But for right now, the default is off, and I'll just leave it off. You can play with the filters to see what makes sense for you for your particular microphone. I've added a few filters in mine to make them sound a little bit better. So this is how you would adjust your coarse gain and your fine gain, and they're all synced together, so they're all doing exactly the same thing. You could also check your USB receive when you do have a call, what kind of audio is coming in from the receive side, as well as the transmit side. So you'll notice in this side, I'm transmitting through the USB, so I am getting good signal coming through as well. You'll also notice that there is a mobile phone section. And notice in this case, I'm also sending information through the mobile phone's transmit. But when you are connected to a phone, maybe you need to check and see if your mobile phone section levels are correct. So that's where you could at least check that out. There's also the speaker section. So make sure that when you're getting a call that you have good signal coming through from the far end. And notice there is processing blocks as well. So if you notice on the matrix view, the processing blocks are added, but they're only there in most cases. Maybe you want to send that to another room, because you're not really going to use sound reinforcement in a Huddle room. But what if you wanted to send these microphones to using a processing block, and you maybe wanted to use some other type of processing? So I could change these to purple, that is pre-AEC, and then I could send that processing block to the output. So that way you could actually send maybe that information to an amplifier that may be feeding a speaker in another room if you wanted to use that. So processing blocks are there if needed, but also notice, as I mentioned earlier, there is no feedback eliminator in this processing block because of not really using sound reinforcement in that actual room. If you'll also notice the gating group, we want to make sure all these mics are responding and cohesively with each other. So that's why you have all those mics are checked off. Maximum number of mics on is 3. You could set up a last mic priority, but in this case, being those 3 ceiling microarray elements, I don't really need a last mic priority on. And NOM, number of open mics, you usually would just have that checked off. Also notice first mic priority is checked on. So if you notice that, if I select my 3 microphones, and this is mainly in the .18 firmware, there was a fix for this. And if I expand this, you'll notice that in my ceiling microarray, only one element is actually gating on and off. You can see that that actually works perfectly there. So depending where you are in the room allows that particular mic to gate on. If someone else were to speak in the same room across from you, maybe their mic element would gate on as well. So that's where you would see that. Another new feature I wanted to bring up while I'm in this section is after you've made all these filters and noise canceling and you got everything how you want it to be, you can actually now right click this and say I want to save this as a template. So let's just say I wanted to save this and CMA mics or something like that. I just call it as CMA mics. I'll just say CMA mic settings. Let me do this. All right. And you could probably write a little description. This is how I want all ceiling mics to act. And I could just hit OK. So the nice thing about this is if you were to go to huddle room number 2 or number 3 or number 10, whichever huddle rooms you may have, when you connect to that huddle, all you have to do is right click and say, I want to apply that template that you just set here. So now you don't have to go make all these settings from scratch every single time. You can now just choose that template. So that's a really nice feature that's not only in Huddle devices, but it's also for the Converge Pro 2 as well. So it's a really nice feature that was added in there. If you want to use Flow View, you can. And this is where you could see where everything is going within the system. You can right-click things and change those and change the route of that if you wanted to. You can unroute this if I wanted to. And then if you wanted to reconnect it to something else, you just drag it over. So let's just say I wanted to use this ceiling microarrays to the processing blocks. I would just get the cross point here, and I would just drag it over to the processing block. And then I'd use the processing block, and I would go to the output, as I mentioned earlier, or something like that. So if you wanted to do that, you could actually make that happen. And also notice anytime you do this within FlowView, the same cross points are made within the matrix view as well. So that's why I wanted at least to make sure you could see how you could use either FlowView or matrix view, either one. Also notice that all my lines are routed around objects. In some cases you may have yours as a default to not do that. It's just straight lines. If you go down to the bottom here, you'll notice line routing, and you can change that to be straight lines, or you can have it route around objects. By the way, to make this easier for you, if you wanted to do that every single time and route around objects, all you have to do is go to File, Options, and under Options you will see Flow View Routing Style, and you can say to route around objects or straight line. So whatever you set this up, however you set up your Pro console, it will do that for you every time. So that's a nice feature. The last thing I wanted to go over is under Matrix View, you will notice we have made our cross points, but we also want to make sure that the far end doesn't get hear themselves through echo. So you do need an AEC reference established. So if you'll notice at the very top, it says here mic output reference. So we're already saying it's set up for speaker 1. So that's why I mentioned if you do hook up a speaker, make sure you go ahead and connect it to the speaker 1 connection there, because right out of the box it is already set up for speaker 1. And you only need one standard reference. It could be speaker 2, it could be speaker 1, it doesn't matter. It could be the outputs as well if you're going to an amp. So you just need one of those as your reference, but right out of the box it is set up for speaker 1. So the whole idea of that is now you're looking at what is all the audio coming out of the speaker that you don't want to send to the back to the far end, and that would be, you know, USB, mobile phone information. All that is the information you don't want to send back to them. So that's why that is a standard reference, and you would use speaker 1 for that particular scenario. And that's it. Pretty simple, huh? So now you could actually just disconnect from the PoE injector from the network if you wanted to. You can leave it connected if you want to. But again, the whole idea of being connected to the Huddle is so that you could configure it. Now all the connections in the front will go over in the next video, where it's more for the end user and how they will actually interface within the actual Huddle itself. So join me for the next video.